Hello there, faithful listener. You've tuned in to Season 7 of the Bible Explained podcast. So make sure to grab your cup of coffee, because today we are going to be discussing the book of 2 Samuel. Hey, faithful listeners, welcome to the Bible Explained podcast. And hi, my name is Jen. I am the host of this particular podcast. For those of you who are members over on Ko-fi, a new episode of Discussions is now up. You will find that linked if you're a Ko-fi member on Ko-fi. That is how you access them. You have to go back to Ko-fi and check out the link that I set up on Ko-fi specifically for you guys. And on this episode of Discussions, my sister and I are talking about the recent Pride Parade that happened in my town. We're talking about that and also the newspaper that covered it, as well as our typical discussion of Christian songs that we either like or dislike. So if you guys are members, check it out over on Ko-fi, or become a member by going to Ko-fi, linked in the description of this episode, if you would like to gain access to discussions or gain early access to YouTube episodes that I do. And also I have a very exciting thing coming out specifically for members that I'm not quite ready to talk about yet, but it is exciting. All right, guys, let's read 2 Samuel 15, 16 through 37, where we will be talking about David fleeing from his own son and just how heartbreaking this whole situation truly is. Make sure to grab your favorite version of the Bible and also your cup of coffee or tea this morning to enjoy as we read this portion together. The king went out, and all of his household after him. The king left 10 women who were concubines to keep the house. The king went out, and all the people after him, and they stayed in Beth-Merhak. All his servants passed on beside him, and all the Cherethites, and the Pelethites, and the Gittites, 600 men who came after him from Gath, passed on before the king. The king said to Ittai the Gittite, "Why do you also go with us? Return and stay with the king, for you are a foreigner, and also an exile. Return to your own place. Whereas you came but yesterday, should I today make you go up and down with us, since I go where I may? Return and take back your brothers. Mercy and truth be with you." Ittai answered the king and said, "As Yahweh lives, and as my lord the king lives, surely in what place my lord the king is, whether for death or for life, your servant will be there also." David said to Ittai, "Go and pass over." Ittai the Gittite passed over, and all of his men, and all the little ones who were with him. All the country wept with a loud voice, and all the people passed over. The king also himself passed over the brook Kidron, and all the people passed over toward the way of the wilderness. Behold, Zadok also came, and all the Levites with him, bearing the ark of the covenant of God. And they set down God's ark, and Abiathar went up until all the people finished passing out of the city. The king said to Zadok, "Carry God's ark back into the city. For if I find favor in Yahweh's eyes, he will bring me again and show me both it and his habitation. But if he says, 'I have no delight in you,' behold, here I am. Let him do to me as seems good to him." The king also said to Zadok the priest, "Aren't you a seer? Return into the city in peace, and your 2 sons with you, Ahimaaz your son, and Jonathan the son of Abiathar. Behold, I will stay at the fords of the wilderness until word comes from you to inform me." Zadok therefore and Abiathar carried God's ark to Jerusalem again, and they stayed there. David went up by the ascent of the Mount of Olives, and wept as he went up. And he had his head covered, and he went barefoot. All the people who were with him each covered his head, and they went up, weeping as they went up. Someone told David, saying, "Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom." David said, "Yahweh, please turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness." When David had come to the top where God was worshipped, behold, Hushai the Archite came to meet him with his tunic torn, and with earth on his head. David said to him, "If you pass on with me, then you will be a burden to me. But if you return to the city and tell Absalom, 'I will be your servant, O king, as I have been your father's servant in time past, so I will now be your servant,' then you will defeat for me the counsel of Ahithophel. Don't you have Zadok and Abiathar the priests there with you? Therefore, whatever you hear out of the king's house, tell it to Zadok and Abiathar the priests. Behold, they have there with them their 2 sons, Ahimaaz Zadok's son, and Jonathan Abiathar's son. Send to me everything that you shall hear by them." So Hushai, David's friend, came into the city, and Absalom came into Jerusalem. There is a lot going on in today's portion, so if you didn't get a chance to listen to the previous episodes, I highly recommend that you do. Or better yet, just read it in the Bible for yourselves before you listen to today's episode. But I will do a quick recap to just remind everybody what's going on. So Absalom, David's son, has made this big conspiracy to take over the throne. And so now David has to flee. He has to become a fugitive all over again. And now he has to do it with Absalom, his own son, because Absalom is planning on killing King David. So it says that the king went out and all of his household after him. So the second they heard that Absalom was going to be made king, that this big conspiracy was happening and that Israel was on the side of Absalom, David was like, we need to get out of Dodge right now because Absalom will kill us all. So it says that all of David's household went with him. This means all of David's wives, all of David's kids most likely, and all of David's servants, everybody that lived in David's house. Except for 10 women who were concubines, David left them behind to keep the house. And the reason he left 10 concubines behind was because David probably thought that Absalom would do nothing to them. He had no reason to think that these 10 concubines would be in any danger because, first and foremost, they were concubines. Secondly, it was pretty well known that you don't mess with your father's wives or concubines. Like, that was a big no-no. You just don't do that. And lastly, David needed somebody to take care of the house, so he left behind 10 concubines. But the sad thing about this, obviously, is that David had concubines, and we know that he did because he had children with concubines. We don't know the names of those children, but we do know that David, in fact, had children with concubines. And he had at least 10 concubines. And concubines were basically legal, legal mistresses would be the best way to put it. Legal girlfriends, I guess. They weren't exactly wives, but they had a lot of the same privileges as wives, but not all the privileges of a wife, obviously. So it's very sad that David was, once again breaking his marriage vows to get legal concubines to live with him. But unfortunately, that was just the sad state of things. So he leaves 10 women behind, these concubines, to take care of the house while he is gone, thinking that these women would be protected. What would Absalom want with 10 concubines? So the king goes, and it says all the people who are with him, and they stayed in Beth Merhak. It says that all of his servants went with him, went beside him, or passed on beside him. And the Cherethites, the Pelethites, and the Gittites, 600 men who came after him from Gath, passed on before the king. These are the same loyal people, these 600 men that David had at the very beginning of 2 Samuel, when David was still fleeing from Saul. These were the same men that apparently remained loyal to David after all of this time. So 600 of these same loyal men went with David. And it mentions that they were Cherethites, Pelethites, and Gittites as well. So the majority, it sounds like, of these men that followed after David were actually foreigners. And that's very notable because David was an Israelite man. And yet Israel, it doesn't seem like, is supporting David at all. It actually mentioned previously in this chapter that Israel was supporting Absalom, David's son, and were rejecting King David during this time. So Israel had abandoned David, and David was left with all of these foreigners who were supporting him once again. So David notices this man named Ittai the Gittite, who is a foreigner who is coming along with King David. And it looks like this guy, Ittai, had just started serving with King David, because David says to him, "Why do you also go with us? Return and stay with the king, for you are a foreigner and also an exile. Return to your own place. You came but yesterday. Should I make you go up and down with us, since I go where I may?" So David notices Ittai coming along with him, and he's like, you just started your job yesterday. I'm not going to force you to come with us if you want to leave. If you want to go to King Absalom, which is actually what David calls him. He calls him the king. I'll talk about that in a second. If you want to go to Absalom and serve him, it's going to be way better for you, Ittai, because coming with me is dangerous. And you just started this, and I am not going to expect you to come along. But Ittai ignores King David and ignores the fact that David had just called Absalom the new king. And Ittai says, answered the king and said, King David, as Yahweh lives, and as my lord the king lives, surely in what place my lord the king is, whether for death or for life, your servant will be there also. So Ittai, it sounds like, had a faith in Yahweh, and also really liked King David and wanted to serve King David. And so he basically says to David, no, Absalom is not the king. You, King David, are the king, and I'm going to serve the king as Yahweh lives. And so Ittai goes along with King David, and David doesn't argue anymore with Ittai. He's like, all right, come on with us if you would like to. So it says that Ittai the Gittite passed over, and all of his men and all of his little ones who were with him. So it sounds like Ittai had a family, and maybe he was in charge of more men, and all of Ittai's men came along as well. So it sounds like many people did support King David, but unfortunately scripture does not mention any Israelites supporting King David. And David, I think, because the Israelites were not supporting him any longer, I think David truly believed in this moment of time that Absalom had won. And that is why David calls Absalom the king. So I don't know if David was just so depressed that he gave up and just allowed Absalom to take over the throne, or if David was trying to surrender to God's will, thinking that God was truly making Absalom the next king and rejecting David. So I don't know what David was thinking here, but we do have a psalm that David wrote during this time. And this is Psalm chapter 3. So let me get there real quick. It's a very short psalm. Here's what it says. This is out of the NIV. Lord, how many are my foes? How many rise up against me? Many are saying of me, God will not deliver him. But you, Lord, are our shield around me, my glory, the one who lifts my head high. I call out to the Lord, and he answers me from his holy mountain. I lie down and sleep, and I wake again because the Lord sustains me. I will not fear, though tens of thousands assail me on every side. Arise, Lord, deliver me, my God. Strike all my enemies on the jaw, break the teeth of the wicked. From the Lord comes deliverance. May your blessing be on your people. So David was clearly afraid. He was afraid of his son. He was afraid of dying. And in fact, I think there are more psalms written during this time period as well. I think David wrote about 5 psalms during the time that he was fleeing from Absalom. But this particular psalm, Psalm chapter 3, notice that David is just crying out to God, asking God to deliver him from his enemies. And he also says here, deliver me, my God, strike all my enemies on the jaw and break the teeth of the wicked. You'll notice that David has an interesting belief, and this is something David maintained for his entire life, that it was the job of God to strike down an enemy of David if they were a king of Israel. Because David refused to kill King Saul, even though Saul was trying to kill David for most of David's young life. And now David is having the same belief for his son Absalom. David has just called Absalom the new king, seemingly believing that Absalom truly is becoming the next king. And yet, David is not going to retaliate against Absalom. Possibly because Absalom is his own son, and possibly because of that old belief that is coming back that you don't kill those who are in charge. It is up to God to kill them. So David is not going to retaliate against Absalom, but he does say here to God, strike all my enemies on the jaw and break the teeth of the wicked. So he's asking God to intervene for him. But going back to 2 Samuel 15, it says that Zadok also came with David and all the Levites who were with him, in verse 24, bearing the ark of the covenant of God, and they set down God's ark, and Abiathar went up until all the people finished passing out of the city. So it sounds like the priests were on the side of David, and they see that David's leaving. They hear about this conspiracy that's happening with Absalom, and they decide to take the ark of the covenant out of the city and travel with David, carrying the ark of the covenant. But actually, David tells them to go back. He says, no, put the ark back in Jerusalem where it belongs. He says, carry God's ark back into the city, for if I find favor in Yahweh's eyes, he will bring me again and show me both it and its habitation. But if he says, I have no delight in you, behold, here I am. Let him do to me as seems good to him. So David's like, look, put the ark back where it belongs, because it's not worth following me. Because if God has rejected me, then what are you guys supposed to do? Just follow me all over the place with the Ark of the Covenant? No, it belongs back in Jerusalem. And if God hasn't rejected me, then I'll be back in Jerusalem right alongside the Ark of the Covenant. And then he also tries to convince Zadok the priest. He says, aren't you a seer, meaning a prophet? That is what seer originally meant. Return into the city in peace, you and your 2 sons with you, Ahimaaz your son, and Jonathan the son of Abiathar. So David reminds Zadok, you are a prophet. God speaks to you. And so it's important for you to be back in Jerusalem, doing your daily duties as a priest with the Ark of the Covenant, because then maybe God will talk to you and will give you some sort of insight about what is happening. So it's important for you and your son, and also Abiathar the priest and his son, to go back to Jerusalem. So it says that the priests listen to David and they take the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem. And meanwhile, David goes up to the Mount of Olives, and it says that he was weeping as he went up, and he was basically wearing sackcloth and ashes. He had his head covered, is what it says, and he went barefoot, showing that he was mourning over having to leave Jerusalem and possibly having the throne taken away from him. And he goes up to the Mount of Olives to pray and to worship God there. It says all the people who were with him also covered his head, and they went up weeping as they went up. So this big procession that David is leading, they all go up to the Mount of Olives together to pray and worship God. And while David was up there, someone comes up to David saying Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. Now, Ahithophel was one of David's friends and one of David's own advisors. And Ahithophel decided to follow after Absalom. I said originally that it's possible that Ahithophel did not know exactly what was happening with Absalom at the very beginning, but if you move into the story more, you will see that Ahithophel absolutely was supporting Absalom instead of King David. He rejected David. And so David finds out about this. He finds out that Ahithophel has completely abandoned him, betrayed him for Absalom. So David prays to Yahweh, Yahweh, please turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness, because apparently Ahithophel was a pretty good counselor. So David asks that that counsel that Ahithophel gave be turned into bad advice. David went up to the top where God was worshipped, and it says that Hushai the Archite came to meet him with his tunic torn and earth on his head. So Hushai was another of David's advisors, and he was a friend of David's as well. And Hushai was very upset over everything that was happening to King David. So he's up at the top of the Mount of Olives, and he also has his tunic torn and he has dirt on his head. He is showing that he is in deep mourning. So he's about to follow King David and to go with King David. But once again, just like David did to the priests, he says to Hushai, his friend, go back to the city of Jerusalem. But don't just go back. Follow after Absalom, pretend to be on Absalom's side, and tell him that you're going to be one of his advisors. And in doing that, maybe you can stop Ahithophel from giving good advice to Absalom. And he encourages Hushai. He says, don't you have Zadok and Abiathar the priests there with you? Therefore, whatever you hear out of the king's house, once again calling Absalom the king, tell it to Zadok and Abiathar the priests. Behold, they have there with them their 2 sons, Ahimaaz Zadok's son and Jonathan Abiathar's son. Send to me everything that you should hear by them. So Hushai agrees. He says, all right, I will do this favor for you, King David. I will pretend to be a friend of Absalom. I'll pretend to be one of his advisors, and I will make sure to give you all the information. I'll be a spy for you, and I'll tell the priests everything that is going on in Absalom's house. So Hushai, David's friend, went into the city, and Absalom also came in to Jerusalem. And Absalom is probably thinking that he has won. He's probably coming into Jerusalem with all of this grandeur and all this splendor, thinking that he is the new king of Israel. But he is in for a very rude awakening. One of the reasons I don't worry about politics too much, though I enjoy politics, but one of the reasons I don't fret about them is because I know that God has everything in control. And stories like the one we read today about how David, it looks like he's no longer going to be the king. You know, those kinds of stories just show that God is ultimately in control, because even when it looks like something cannot happen, God can do amazing and crazy miracles. And ultimately, it is God who decides the outcome of anything. It says in scripture specifically that God sets kings up and he takes them down. So ultimately, everything is up to God. Anyway, faithful listeners, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, share it on your social media platforms. Tell people that the Bible Explained podcast exists. I will see you all on the next Old Testament episode on Friday. We're going to get more into the story of David and just some of the betrayal he's going to experience on Friday. So that's going to be a great episode, a good, encouraging episode as well. So I hope that you tune in for that one. I will see you guys on Friday, if I don't see you tomorrow for the New Testament side of stuff. But until then, happy listening and God bless.